At the southernmost tip of South America lies Tierra del Fuego, a rugged and windswept archipelago where the Selk'nam, or Ona, people once roamed. This remote land, marked by relentless winds, snow-dusted plains, and dense forests, shaped a people who were as resilient as the environment itself. The Selk'nam were primarily hunters and gatherers, deeply attuned to the rhythms of the land, relying on wild game, edible plants, and the careful use of natural resources for their survival. Their society, though simple in its reliance on nature, was complex in its organization, spiritual beliefs, and social customs. The arrival of Europeans, explorers, missionaries, and sheep ranchers, dramatically altered their world. For outsiders seeking gold, grazing land, or adventure, the Selk'nam were seen not as human beings with their own culture and knowledge, but as obstacles to be removed. This collision between cultures led to a devastating chapter in history, one marked by violence, exploitation, and near-total eradication. The bounty hunters, operating with impunity, transformed human life into a commodity. Among them, the notorious figure known as Red Pig became infamous for offering extra payment for a mutilated corpse's breast, a grotesque reward signaling that a woman had been killed. Missionary activity, framed as spiritual salvation, often worsened the destruction. Communities were forcibly relocated, rapid cultural assimilation was imposed, and contagious diseases spread with lethal efficiency. By the end of the 19th century, the Selk'nam numbered between 3,500 and 4,000, but by the 1970s, as the first ethnographic films and records were made, their population had dwindled to nearly zero. Survivors lived isolated lives, disconnected from the structures, rituals, and traditions that had once defined their society. Those who endured faced a world stripped of meaning, where survival was no longer merely a struggle against nature, but a confrontation with the overwhelming pressures of colonialism, disease, and loss. Despite this near extinction, the Selk'nam were not passive victims. Historical research reveals that they resisted in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. In the late 19th century, when Europeans began occupying their lands, the Selk'nam attempted to protect their homes, livelihoods, and way of life. Ethnographic sources suggest they developed strategies of resistance, navigating the oppressive pressures of colonization with ingenuity and determination. They were not simply swept aside, they fought, adapted, and sought to preserve their culture in whatever ways were possible under extreme circumstances. Population figures, long thought to be between 3,500 and 4,000, have been re-examined by modern research. Evidence now suggests their numbers may have been closer to 1,500, reflecting the harshness of Tierra del Fuego's environment. The land was unforgiving, and the Selk'nam lived in small, dispersed groups, sometimes just 4 individuals per 100 square kilometers, making them highly vulnerable to disease and external attacks. When missionaries gathered many individuals into single settlements, infectious diseases spread rapidly, accelerating their decline. Yet, the story of the Selk'nam does not end with disappearance. In recent decades, descendants have begun reclaiming their identity, reconnecting with their heritage, and asserting themselves as Selk'nam once more. This process, described as ethnoheterogenesis, illustrates how a nearly lost culture can regenerate, how people can rediscover and reconstruct their identity, and how memory, tradition, and self-recognition can defy the erasure imposed by history. Today, communities like Covadonga Ona, with over 200 individuals, are actively working to revive Selk'nam traditions, language, and cultural practices. The Selk'nam's survival is a story of ingenuity, adaptation, and spiritual depth. They had a rich understanding of their environment, carefully managed their hunting grounds, and developed rituals, myths, and social rules that reflected both moral and practical knowledge. Their society was organized, their spiritual life complex, and their identity resilient. Even when outside forces attempted to erase them, fragments of their culture survived, through oral memory, through the painstaking records of ethnographers, and now, through the determined revival efforts of their descendants. This introduction sets the stage for a journey into a world that once existed at the very edge of the world. A culture that thrived in extreme conditions, faced unimaginable adversity, and yet continues to inspire through its survival. The Selk'nam story is not just one of loss, it is one of courage, resistance, and the enduring human spirit. Their history reminds us that cultures are living legacies, fragile yet remarkably resilient, and that even when nearly erased, they can rise again to claim their place in the world. Among the most striking and enigmatic elements of Selk'nam culture was the Hain ceremony, a complex initiation ritual that played a central role in their social, spiritual, and moral life. The Hain was not merely a festive gathering, it was a carefully orchestrated event that marked the transition of young men from childhood to adulthood and reinforced the social order of the tribe. At its core, the Hain embodied the Selk'nam understanding of the universe, human behavior, and the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. Preparation for the Hain began well in advance, involving both young initiates and the elders of the tribe. The participants had to demonstrate courage, endurance, and a willingness to embrace the teachings of their community. Young men, sometimes in their early teens, were carefully observed by the elders to determine their readiness. They would be instructed in the moral codes, hunting knowledge, and social responsibilities they were expected to uphold. This knowledge was critical. In a harsh and unforgiving environment like Tierra del Fuego, social cohesion and practical wisdom were essential for survival. The central spectacle of the Hain was a series of dramatic enactments performed by the men of the tribe, often using elaborate body paint, masks, and symbolic costumes. These figures, known as the spirits of the Hain, represented both real and supernatural forces, blending fear and fascination into the experience. The ritualized antagonism between the masked men and the young initiates served multiple purposes. It was a test of bravery, a lesson in respect for tribal norms, and a way to teach the limits of human behavior within the community. Through this process, the young men confronted simulated danger and learned to distinguish between courage and recklessness, obedience and defiance. Symbolism was everywhere in the Hain. The painted designs, the sounds, the movements, and the timing of each act conveyed layered meanings. Some elements represented ancestral spirits, others the natural forces that governed hunting and survival, and yet others encoded social hierarchies and relationships. By participating, initiates internalized these lessons, reinforcing their place within the tribe and their responsibility toward the collective well-being. The elders, who enacted the most dangerous and fearsome figures, were respected as custodians of this sacred knowledge, guiding the ritual and ensuring that its lessons were transmitted accurately. The Hain was not only a masculine rite, it also involved the wider community. Women, children, and other non-initiates observed the proceedings and participated in supporting roles. Their involvement reinforced the interconnectedness of all members of Selk'nam society. While the young men faced the ritual challenges, the community collectively celebrated the continuity of knowledge and the cohesion of social life. In this way, the Hain was both a personal journey and a communal reaffirmation of identity, culture, and survival skills. The intensity and psychological depth of the Hain cannot be overstated. For the young men, it was an encounter with fear, authority, and the unknown. For the elders, it was an act of teaching and preserving tradition. Every gesture, every painted line, every mask, and every chant carried meaning. To outsiders, the ceremony could appear chaotic or even violent, but within the framework of Selk'nam understanding, it was highly ordered, morally instructive, and essential to the continuity of the tribe. The Hain also reflected the Selk'nam worldview, in which the spiritual and material were intertwined. By embodying spirits, simulating threats, and creating ritualized tension, the community affirmed its understanding of life, death, and the forces that shaped both. The ceremony reinforced the connection between humans, animals, and the unseen world, illustrating how the Selk'nam perceived balance, power, and responsibility. It was a living pedagogy, where lessons were learned not through words alone but through embodied experience, fear, and awe. Unfortunately, the practice of the Hain was severely disrupted by colonization, disease, and displacement. As European settlers encroached on their lands, the Selk'nam population declined rapidly, and the conditions necessary for conducting such complex rituals disappeared. Photographs and ethnographic records by researchers such as Martin Guzand and Chapman provide the only surviving visual and descriptive accounts of the Hain. These records reveal a ritual of immense sophistication, blending social order, spiritual belief, and psychological training, offering insight into a people whose cultural depth was once largely unknown. Today, the Hain remains a symbol of Selk'nam resilience and ingenuity. For modern descendants, studying, understanding, and occasionally reconstructing elements of the ceremony represents a connection to their heritage and a reclaiming of identity. It stands as a reminder that even in the face of near-total eradication, knowledge, ritual, and cultural memory can endure. The Hain is more than a historical curiosity, it is an enduring testament to the Selk'nam's sophisticated social systems, their spiritual vision, and their ability to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Through the lens of the Hain, we see the Selk'nam not as a vanished people, but as a society of remarkable depth and ingenuity, whose teachings, values, and rituals continue to echo across time, offering lessons about courage, community, and the enduring power of culture. Among the darkest chapters in the history of the Selk'nam people is the arrival of bounty hunters, men who viewed human lives as commodities to be bought, sold, and killed for profit. Among these hunters, one figure stands out in historical records for his cruelty and notoriety, a man known as the Red Pig. The name itself evokes horror, a grim reminder of the brutality inflicted upon the Selk'nam during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Red Pig operated in the remote plains and mountains of Tierra del Fuego, hired by European settlers, ranchers, and companies seeking to expand sheep grazing territories and control valuable land. For the settlers, indigenous people were seen as obstacles, an inconvenient presence that threatened their claims to the land. Red Pig and his fellow bounty hunters were tasked with eliminating this obstacle, and they carried out their work with shocking efficiency and cruelty. What made Red Pig particularly infamous was his willingness to treat human lives as currency. He reportedly offered additional payment for the breasts of killed women, seeing it as a mark of success in his gruesome work. Such acts were not isolated incidents but part of a systematic campaign to terrorize, decimate, and displace the Selk'nam population. Each kill, each mutilation, served as a warning to others and as proof of the hunters' effectiveness to those paying for their deaths. It was a commodification of life on a scale almost unimaginable, reducing a vibrant culture to targets in a lethal game. The presence of Red Pig and others like him had a profound impact on Selk'nam society. The traditional social structure, spiritual practices, and seasonal migrations that had governed life for centuries were disrupted as families fled, settlements were abandoned, and survivors scattered. Fear became a constant companion. Hunting, once a skillful and communal activity, now carried the risk of lethal encounters with humans who were more dangerous than any predator or storm. The Selk'nam's intimate knowledge of the land, which had ensured their survival for generations, could not protect them against these external threats. Ethnographic accounts and historical records describe not only the killings but the psychological terror instilled by Red Pig. Stories passed down through the surviving Selk'nam and recorded by researchers like Chapman recount the dread inspired by bounty hunters. The hunters operated with impunity, often sanctioned or ignored by authorities, and the legal system prioritized settler interests over indigenous life. For the Selk'nam, survival was no longer a matter of skill and knowledge alone, it required constant vigilance against a new kind of predator, humans armed with guns, greed, and lethal intent. Red Pig symbolizes the larger forces of colonization and ethnocide that swept across Tierra del Fuego. While disease, displacement, and cultural suppression all contributed to the decline of the Selk'nam, the calculated violence of bounty hunters accelerated their near extinction. The Selk'nam, already vulnerable due to small population size, dispersed groups, and environmental pressures, faced annihilation at the hands of men who saw their existence as an impediment to profit. Yet even in this period of darkness, fragments of the Selk'nam story survived, preserved through photographs, interviews, and ethnographic records. Red Pig's infamy underscores not only the brutality faced by the Selk'nam but also the resilience required to endure and remember. It serves as a chilling illustration of how human greed and cruelty can threaten entire cultures, and why the preservation of knowledge, ritual, and identity is so crucial for marginalized and vanishing peoples. The tale of Red Pig is more than historical horror, it is a reminder of the moral and ethical responsibility owed to indigenous populations and the lessons that history demands we remember. It highlights the fragility of culture when confronted by violence, the resilience of human memory, and the enduring importance of documenting and honoring the lives of those who faced unimaginable threats. In studying figures like Red Pig, we confront the stark reality of what happens when profit and prejudice are placed above humanity, and we are forced to acknowledge the costs paid by the Selk'nam in the shadows of Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego, at the southernmost tip of South America, is one of the most remote and dramatic regions on the planet. The archipelago lies at the meeting point of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, where icy currents collide and wind sweeps across the landscape with relentless force. Its terrain is a striking combination of jagged mountains, rolling plains, dense forests, peat bogs, and rivers fed by glaciers. The geography of Tierra del Fuego is harsh, fragmented, and often unforgiving, creating an environment in which life must constantly adapt to survive. For centuries, this land remained largely unknown to outsiders, preserving an ecosystem and a human culture uniquely adapted to its extremes. The climate of Tierra del Fuego is cold and temperate, with sharp fluctuations throughout the year. Storms can appear without warning, bringing driving rain, snow, and violent winds. Winters are long and unforgiving, often plunging temperatures far below freezing. Summers, though brief, are windy and unpredictable, with sudden frosts or deluges. These conditions have shaped not only the physical environment but also the lives of every organism that inhabits it. Plant species here are specialized to withstand frost, wind, and nutrient-poor soils. Animals, from guanacos and foxes to birds and fish, have developed migratory patterns, foraging strategies, and behaviors adapted to scarcity and seasonality. The environment is at once a provider and a constant challenge. Amid these extreme conditions lived the Selk'nam, also known as the Ona, an indigenous people who had thrived in this unforgiving land for centuries. The Selk'nam were one of the southernmost human populations on Earth and had developed a lifestyle entirely shaped by their environment. Unlike sedentary agricultural societies, they were nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving across the plains, valleys, and forests with a deep understanding of the land's rhythms. Their survival depended on an intimate knowledge of local geography, animal behavior, seasonal changes, and weather patterns. Every step they took, every hunting expedition, and every camp they established was informed by centuries of accumulated environmental intelligence. The Selk'nam's relationship with their environment was multidimensional. The land was not merely a source of food or shelter, it was central to their culture, spirituality, and social organization. Mountains, rivers, and plains were regarded as living entities, each with its own spirit and significance. Rivers were not just sources of fish or fresh water, they were pathways, boundaries, and sites of ceremonial importance. Forests were places of concealment, refuge, and resources for tools and clothing. Even the wind, which could be lethal, held meaning within their cosmology and oral traditions. This deep integration of environment and culture ensured that knowledge of the land was preserved and transmitted across generations. Hunting and gathering were the core of Selk'nam survival strategies. They hunted guanacos, a camelid native to southern South America, using bows, arrows, and spears crafted with careful attention to both material and technique. They were expert trackers, reading subtle signs such as footprints, broken vegetation, and the behavior of birds to locate prey. Hunting was not only a matter of sustenance, it was a skill that required cooperation, patience, and profound observation. Failure could mean starvation, and success demanded precision and foresight. Fishing, trapping, and foraging for edible plants and roots complemented hunting, ensuring a diversified diet that could endure the scarcity of winter months. Their clothing and shelters also reflected their intimate understanding of the environment. Garments made from guanaco hides protected them against the relentless wind and freezing temperatures, while camp constructions were simple but highly effective, providing temporary shelter that could be quickly relocated as they followed seasonal migrations. Every aspect of material culture, tools, clothing, firemaking, and shelters, was optimized for survival in a landscape that allowed no inefficiency. The Selk'nam's knowledge extended to medicinal plants and natural remedies. They understood which plants could treat wounds, alleviate pain, or serve as preventative measures against disease. This knowledge, largely transmitted orally, demonstrates the Selk'nam's ability to not only survive but also to thrive in conditions that would have overwhelmed less skilled populations. Their expertise represents a profound adaptation to one of the most extreme environments inhabited by humans. Beyond the practical, the land shaped Selk'nam's spirituality and social life. The Selk'nam perceived themselves as an integral part of the ecological system. Their myths, stories, and rituals often centered on the forces of nature, reflecting both reverence and fear. Mountains, rivers, and forests were not passive backdrops but active participants in human existence, capable of rewarding or punishing behavior. These beliefs were codified in ceremonies, initiation rites, and oral histories, reinforcing environmental knowledge while embedding it in a moral and cultural framework. Seasonality dictated almost every aspect of life. Spring and summer were times of mobility and resource gathering, while winter required careful rationing and sheltering. Camps were strategically located to exploit seasonal abundance and to provide protection from storms. Hunting routes were memorized and shared across the community, forming a complex mental map of the land that enabled the Selk'nam to navigate hundreds of kilometers of unpredictable terrain. Their movements were not random, they were meticulously calculated, reflecting a deep and sophisticated understanding of their environment. Isolation helped preserve Selk'nam culture for centuries. Far from European colonization, their social systems, kinship structures, and spiritual practices remained intact, allowing generations to maintain continuity and cohesion. This isolation, however, was a double-edged sword. While it protected their culture from outside influence, it left them vulnerable to newcomers whose intentions were shaped not by survival but by greed and exploitation. The land that had nurtured and protected them for millennia could not shield them from the cultural and physical devastation that would follow contact with Europeans and later settlers. Tierra del Fuego, with its storms, plains, forests, and mountains, serves as both cradle and witness to the lives of the Selk'nam. It is a land that tested human endurance, inspired remarkable ingenuity, and preserved a culture uniquely adapted to the extreme. Understanding this landscape is essential to understanding the Selk'nam, for it was here, at the very edge of the world, that their extraordinary story of survival, adaptation, and culture unfolded, a story that, though nearly erased, still echoes through the windswept plains and jagged peaks of Tierra del Fuego. The Selk'nam, or Ona, were among the southernmost human populations on Earth, inhabiting the windswept plains, forests, and mountains of Tierra del Fuego. Unlike agricultural societies elsewhere, they were hunter-gatherers, relying entirely on their intimate knowledge of the land and its resources. Survival was not a matter of convenience, it was a constant challenge. Every decision, every movement, and every action had consequences, often the difference between life and death. Their daily lives were shaped by the cycles of nature, the migrations of animals, and the demands of a climate that was as unpredictable as it was harsh. Nomadism defined the Selk'nam way of life. They did not establish permanent settlements, but moved across their territories in response to seasonal availability of food and other resources. Spring and summer were periods of mobility, when the hunting of guanacos, rheas, and other game was most productive, and when berries, roots, and edible plants could be gathered in abundance. Autumn and winter required careful planning, as food became scarce and exposure to freezing temperatures increased the risk of death. Camps were strategically chosen, usually in sheltered valleys, near water sources, and close to areas known to attract game. These camps were temporary but efficient, designed for quick assembly and disassembly, allowing the Selk'nam to relocate as conditions demanded. Hunting was the cornerstone of survival. The guanaco, a large camelid native to the region, was their primary prey, providing meat for food, hides for clothing, and bones and sinews for tools. Hunting guanacos required skill, knowledge, and cooperation. Hunters tracked herds over vast distances, reading footprints, broken vegetation, and animal behavior to predict their movements. They used spears and bows with precision, often coordinating in groups to drive herds toward ambush points. The hunt was more than a physical challenge, it demanded strategy, observation, and patience. Mistakes could result in injury or starvation, and success required the combined effort of the group. In addition to guanacos, the Selk'nam hunted smaller mammals, birds, and fish. They also gathered edible plants, roots, and berries, as well as shellfish and other resources along the coasts. This diverse diet reflected their detailed understanding of seasonal cycles and ecological systems. They knew which plants were safe to eat, which were poisonous, and which could be used medicinally. Their knowledge of the environment extended to all living things, allowing them to exploit resources sustainably, without depleting them. Tools and technology were adapted to the harsh conditions of Tierra del Fuego. Bows, arrows, and spears were crafted with local wood, bone, and sinew, designed for both effectiveness and durability. Knives, scrapers, and other cutting implements were carefully shaped from stone, bone, or wood. Clothing was made primarily from guanaco hides, sewn and tanned to provide warmth and protection against wind and rain. The Selk'nam also used fire strategically, both for warmth and for hunting, signaling, and ritual purposes. Every item, from weapons to clothing, reflected a deep understanding of materials, climate, and the demands of survival. The Selk'nam's social organization facilitated effective cooperation in daily life and in hunting. Groups were typically composed of extended families, with elders passing down knowledge to younger members. Leadership was informal and situational, often emerging during hunts or ceremonies based on skill, experience, and wisdom. This social structure allowed for coordination without rigid hierarchy, essential for a mobile, hunter-gatherer society where flexibility and communication were critical. The landscape itself shaped the Selk'nam's physical abilities. Constant movement across uneven terrain, exposure to harsh weather, and participation in labor-intensive hunting and gathering developed endurance, strength, and adaptability. Men and women shared responsibilities, with women gathering plants, preparing food, and assisting in hunting small game, while men tracked and hunted larger animals. Children learned survival skills from an early age, observing adults and participating in controlled tasks, gradually acquiring the knowledge needed to thrive in an unforgiving environment. Seasonal adaptation was crucial. In winter, the Selk'nam relied more heavily on stored foods, small game, and fishing. Clothing and shelters were reinforced to withstand storms, and group cohesion became critical to survival. In summer, mobility increased, as they followed guanaco herds and gathered seasonal plant resources. This cyclical lifestyle required precise timing, observation, and flexibility. A misjudgment of animal migration or weather patterns could have fatal consequences, demonstrating the constant vigilance and intelligence required to live in Tierra del Fuego. Beyond survival, the Selk'nam developed complex cultural practices that were intertwined with their environment. Hunting was not simply an economic activity, it held spiritual significance. Myths, stories, and rituals celebrated the animals and landscapes that sustained them. Knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal cycles was encoded in songs, stories, and ceremonies, reinforcing practical information while embedding it in a cultural framework. Every aspect of life, from movement and hunting to ritual and storytelling, reflected an adaptive response to the demands of one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Selk'nam's mastery of survival extended to navigation and environmental prediction. They memorized intricate mental maps of terrain, rivers, and hunting grounds, allowing them to travel vast distances without permanent markers. They could anticipate weather changes, locate water and food sources, and adapt their movements to the shifting conditions of plains, forests, and mountains. Their knowledge was comprehensive, dynamic, and essential to maintaining life in a region where the margin for error was minimal. In all these ways, the Selk'nam exemplified resilience, intelligence, and ingenuity. Their mastery of Tierra del Fuego was a combination of physical endurance, environmental knowledge, social cooperation, and cultural transmission. For centuries, they thrived where many others could not, demonstrating how human societies can adapt and flourish even in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth. Their life was a continuous dialogue with the land, a delicate balance of risk, reward, and respect that sustained them through generations. The Selk'nam people, navigating the harsh landscapes of Tierra del Fuego, were not merely survivors of a formidable environment, they were participants in a highly structured social world, a society whose cohesion depended on intricate rules, traditions, and relationships. Each member of the community had a role, and every role carried responsibilities essential to the survival and continuity of the group. Their society was organized around kinship, alliances, and the careful negotiation of social power, which enabled the group to function effectively in conditions that demanded cooperation and trust. Family was the central unit of Selk'nam life. Extended families, often consisting of multiple generations, formed the core of social interaction and labor. Men, women, and children each had clearly defined roles, but these were flexible when circumstances demanded adaptability. Men typically led hunting parties for guanacos, deer, and other game, employing knowledge of animal behavior, weather patterns, and terrain to ensure the success of their expeditions. Women were responsible for gathering plant foods, processing hides for clothing, preparing meals, and teaching younger generations essential skills. Children learned through direct observation and practice, gradually absorbing the extensive knowledge required to survive in a harsh and unpredictable landscape. Survival and cultural transmission were inseparable. Raising a child meant imparting not just practical skills but also moral and social norms. Kinship extended beyond immediate family. Clans and subgroups within the Selk'nam population created networks of relationships that governed marriage, inheritance, and alliances. Exogamous marriage rules, requiring individuals to marry outside their immediate kin group, fostered social cohesion between clans and ensured genetic diversity, which was vital for long-term survival. These rules were strictly enforced, and violations were rare, often resolved through ceremonial negotiation or mediation by elders. Elders held significant influence, providing guidance on both practical and spiritual matters. Their wisdom, accumulated over decades of experience, shaped decisions on hunting, conflict resolution, and the timing of rituals. Authority within the community was situational rather than hierarchical. A respected hunter might lead a hunting expedition, while a skilled healer or spiritual leader could guide ceremonial activities. Rivalries and subtle power struggles existed alongside the outward harmony of the group. While cooperation was essential for survival, competition for status, respect, and prestige played a significant role in social dynamics. Accomplished hunters and individuals demonstrating exceptional skill in ritual or physical endurance could gain elevated standing within the group. Such status often translated into influence over decision-making and ritual leadership, though it never undermined the collective responsibilities necessary for survival. These social tensions were carefully balanced through formal and informal mechanisms, including ceremonies, storytelling, and conflict resolution practices, which maintained cohesion while allowing individuals to express ambition and skill. Social norms were also enforced through ritualized forms of behavior. Initiation ceremonies, such as the Hain, played a crucial role in the transmission of cultural values, social rules, and status hierarchies. These rituals were not merely symbolic. They were educational and disciplinary, teaching young men the boundaries of acceptable behavior, the importance of bravery, and the responsibilities owed to both family and clan. The ceremonies often involved complex role-playing, mimicry, and challenges designed to test courage, obedience, and social understanding. Such practices reinforced the group's cohesion and ensured that each generation internalized the norms necessary for survival in both the social and physical environment. Communication within the Selk'nam was nuanced and rich. Language conveyed not only practical information about hunting, migration, and resource availability, but also social cues, moral instruction, and spiritual knowledge. Storytelling was a central method of education, blending history, myth, and observation of the natural world. These narratives preserved collective memory, reinforcing kinship bonds and shared identity. They taught lessons about respecting the land, maintaining social order, and valuing cooperation over individual gain. In this way, language functioned as both a practical tool and a repository of cultural wisdom. Leadership within the group was dynamic and situational. While there were no rigid hierarchies, individuals recognized as particularly knowledgeable, skilled, or courageous often assumed temporary authority in specific contexts, such as leading hunting expeditions or guiding rituals. Decisions were frequently made collectively, with elders mediating disputes and offering counsel. Social cohesion depended on negotiation, persuasion, and the shared understanding that the survival of the group outweighed personal ambitions. This flexible approach allowed the Selk'nam to respond effectively to environmental challenges, adapt to scarcity, and maintain unity under pressure. Conflict resolution was embedded in social practice and ritual. Disagreements over hunting territories, resource use, or family obligations could arise, but these were managed through a combination of negotiation, mediation, and ceremonial intervention. Public rituals often served to reinforce social norms, reminding individuals of collective obligations and the consequences of transgression. This system balanced individual initiative with communal responsibility, ensuring that personal disputes did not threaten the broader survival of the group. The Selk'nam's social world also intersected with their environment in profound ways. Land, animals, and natural features were deeply embedded in social relationships. Territories were carefully defined and respected, with families and clans holding knowledge of specific hunting grounds, water sources, and shelter locations. Sharing of resources was guided by established norms, reflecting a balance between individual needs and collective welfare. Social cohesion and environmental stewardship were inseparable. Cooperation within the group directly enhanced survival in the unpredictable landscape of Tierra del Fuego. Marriage, inheritance, and ceremonial participation were mechanisms that reinforced both social and ecological stability. Marriages created alliances between clans, linking social networks and ensuring access to diverse territories and resources. Inheritance rules ensured that knowledge, property, and responsibilities were passed down in ways that maintained continuity and avoided conflict. Ceremonial life, including ritualized dances, initiation rites, and collective gatherings, reinforced these systems, blending spiritual, social, and practical elements into a coherent cultural framework. Through these interconnected social structures, the Selk'nam demonstrated remarkable resilience. Their society was not static but highly adaptive, capable of responding to both environmental fluctuations and internal social challenges. Cooperation, knowledge transmission, ritual, and kinship networks all combined to form a cohesive system that supported survival in one of the most extreme environments inhabited by humans. Each individual's actions were guided by both practical necessity and cultural expectation, creating a society in which personal skill and social responsibility were intertwined. The story of the Selk'nam's social life reveals a sophisticated balance between individual ambition and collective welfare, between competition and cooperation, and between human needs and environmental constraints. They were masters not only of survival in a harsh landscape but also of complex social negotiation, strategic alliance, and cultural continuity. Their social structures allowed them to endure, thrive, and maintain cultural integrity for centuries in a land that tested every aspect of human ingenuity and resilience. In every interaction, from family life to ceremonial participation, the Selk'nam demonstrated that survival was inseparable from social intelligence. They were not isolated individuals reacting to environmental pressures, but members of a dynamic, adaptive, and interdependent society. This society, shaped by the extremes of Tierra del Fuego, represents a profound example of human adaptability, not merely in material terms, but in the organization of relationships, the transmission of knowledge, and the balance between individual skill and collective responsibility. Their social world was as vital to survival as their hunting techniques, clothing, or shelters. Without this intricate social network, life in Tierra del Fuego would have been impossible, no matter how skilled or resourceful individuals were. The Selk'nam people of Tierra del Fuego lived in a world where the spiritual and physical realms were inseparable, where the forces of nature were inhabited by spirits that could guide, punish, or test humanity. Their cosmology was intricate, populated with beings, powers, and moral lessons that explained the mysteries of life and the dangers of their harsh environment. Mountains, rivers, plains, and forests were not simply physical spaces. They were imbued with spiritual significance, acting as the stage on which humans, animals, and spirits interacted in a constant and delicate balance. Every element of their environment carried meaning, and understanding these forces was essential not only for survival but also for social and moral order. Central to the Selk'nam worldview was the recognition of spirits that animated the natural world. Animals were not mere sources of food, they were sacred beings with agency and intention. Hunters were expected to approach them with respect and ritual awareness, acknowledging their power and the ethical implications of taking life. Myths conveyed these principles, instructing young Selk'nam in the proper conduct of hunting, resource management, and social behavior. Spirits were both protectors and enforcers of moral codes, guiding human behavior while simultaneously reminding the community of its responsibilities to the land and one another. Among the most remarkable expressions of Selk'nam spirituality was the Hain, an initiation ceremony that was both a rite of passage and a complex social instrument. The Hain took place during specific seasons, when the community gathered in preparation for the event that would transform boys into men and reinforce the social hierarchy of the group. The ritual was elaborate, highly structured, and infused with symbolic meaning. It involved storytelling, dance, costume, and enactment, blending performance, education, and social regulation into a single, cohesive experience. The Hain was conducted in a sacred space, often a secluded area chosen for its natural isolation, which served to heighten the sense of otherworldliness and danger. Young boys, known as initiates, were introduced to this world gradually, guided and tested by elders and ritual specialists. They were exposed to the presence of masked figures, representing supernatural beings, who enacted scenarios that ranged from frightening to morally instructive. The initiates were required to demonstrate courage, restraint, and social understanding as they navigated these encounters. The ritual was at once exhilarating and terrifying, instilling lessons about bravery, respect for the community, and the consequences of social transgression. Costumes and masks played a central role in the Hain, transforming human participants into spirits and blurring the boundary between the mundane and the supernatural. Masks were painted and decorated with feathers, fur, and symbolic markings, each representing specific spirits or moral forces. The performance was dramatic and precise, with movements, gestures, and sounds designed to communicate meaning beyond words. The initiates learned to interpret these signs, gaining insight into the spiritual and social rules that governed Selk'nam life. The Hain also served to teach sexual and social roles. Young men were confronted with representations of sexual antagonism and social taboos, lessons that were vital for understanding the dynamics of adult life within the community. These enactments were never gratuitous but carefully controlled and codified, designed to integrate ethical instruction with the development of social skills, self-discipline, and empathy. The ritual ensured that each generation internalized the norms necessary for maintaining cohesion, hierarchy, and morality within the group. Storytelling was deeply intertwined with the Hain. Myths, legends, and historical narratives were performed and enacted, conveying the history of the people, the lessons of survival, and the ethical framework that guided behavior. Initiates learned not only practical survival skills but also the values that allowed a society in such a harsh environment to endure: cooperation, courage, respect for nature, and awareness of the consequences of one's actions. The ceremony was both educational and transformative, preparing individuals for the responsibilities of adulthood while reinforcing the collective identity of the community. Spiritual leaders and elders directed the Hain with authority derived from both age and accumulated knowledge. These figures were custodians of ritual knowledge, moral codes, and social wisdom. Their role extended beyond performance. They were educators, mediators, and guardians of cultural continuity. Their decisions during the ceremony reflected a deep understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the environmental context in which the Selk'nam lived. The Hain was as much a test of the community's integrity and cohesion as it was a rite for the individual. The Hain also served as a subtle mechanism for managing social tensions. Through ritualized enactments of fear, power, and taboo, conflicts over status, rivalry, and competition could be safely expressed and regulated. The ceremony reinforced social hierarchies and the authority of elders while teaching young men the limits of acceptable behavior. In this way, the spiritual dimension of Selk'nam life was inseparable from its social structure. Belief, morality, and social cohesion were all intertwined in a framework that ensured both survival and cultural continuity. Every element of the Hain was tied to the land itself. The selection of the ceremonial space, the timing of the rituals, and the symbolic elements used in masks and costumes reflected an acute awareness of seasonal cycles, environmental conditions, and the spiritual significance of specific locations. Nature was a participant in the ritual, its winds, storms, and terrain integrated into the experience. The ceremony was not an abstraction but a lived engagement with both the physical and spiritual environment, reinforcing the Selk'nam's intimate connection to the land that sustained them. In essence, the Hain and broader spiritual beliefs of the Selk'nam were a masterful synthesis of education, moral instruction, social cohesion, and environmental awareness. They exemplified the people's ability to encode complex knowledge and values into rituals that ensured the survival of both individuals and the community. Spiritual life was inseparable from practical life, understanding the unseen forces, respecting the spirits of animals and land, and mastering the lessons of ritualized experience were all part of the knowledge required to navigate life in Tierra del Fuego. Through these practices, the Selk'nam developed a culture in which survival, ethics, and spirituality were inseparable. Their belief system reinforced environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and collective resilience. The Hain stood as a living testament to the ingenuity of a people who had thrived for centuries in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. It was a ceremony of transformation, a school of life, and a celebration of identity. All conducted in the context of a harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving world that demanded both respect and understanding. The spiritual world of the Selk'nam, embodied in the Hain, was a bridge between the human and the natural, the social and the moral, the physical and the supernatural. It taught courage, responsibility, and harmony with the environment. It was a central pillar of a society that, despite the isolation and severity of its surroundings, developed an intricate and enduring cultural framework, a framework that allowed a people to thrive, govern themselves, and pass on their knowledge across generations in the face of relentless natural challenges. The story of the Selk'nam takes a dramatic turn with the arrival of outsiders to Tierra del Fuego. For centuries, the Selk'nam had thrived in relative isolation, their lives shaped entirely by the rhythms of the land, the movements of animals, and the cycles of the seasons. Their culture, spiritual practices, and social structures were finely attuned to the environment. But the 19th century brought a wave of European explorers, missionaries, and settlers into their world. A convergence of curiosity, commerce, and conquest that would alter their lives forever. The first encounters were with European explorers seeking to map the southernmost reaches of the continent. These men, often driven by scientific curiosity or imperial ambition, traversed the islands, charting coastlines, rivers, and mountains. Their reports described windswept plains, dense forests, and rugged mountains, but they also noted the presence of the indigenous population. To the Selk'nam, these visitors were strange and unpredictable, with unfamiliar languages, clothing, and tools. Initial contact was cautious, marked by observation, tentative trade, and mutual curiosity. Yet even at this stage, the imbalance of power was evident. The Selk'nam had no immunity to European diseases, no familiarity with European weapons, and no understanding of the intentions driving these newcomers. Missionaries soon followed the explorers, bringing not only religion but a vision of civilizing the indigenous population. These missionaries believed that spiritual salvation and cultural transformation were intertwined, and they saw the Selk'nam as a people in need of guidance. They introduced new religious practices, schooling, and labor systems, often forcing Selk'nam families to relocate to mission stations. The missionaries' intentions were couched in morality, yet the consequences were devastating. Daily life, traditional social structures, and seasonal patterns were disrupted. Elders and ritual specialists lost authority, as the imposed religious hierarchy replaced the indigenous system of leadership and knowledge transmission. Alongside missionaries came settlers and ranchers, seeking to exploit the land for grazing and resource extraction. Tierra del Fuego's plains were ideal for sheep farming, and settlers claimed vast tracts of land that had been the lifeblood of the Selk'nam for generations. The newcomers' concept of property clashed violently with the Selk'nam's understanding of territory. Land was not owned in the European sense, it was shared, seasonal, and vital to survival. European fences, livestock, and land management disrupted migratory routes, hunting grounds, and access to freshwater sources. The Selk'nam were suddenly confronted not only with strangers but with a systematic transformation of their environment. These interactions were not peaceful. Early misunderstandings escalated into conflict, often fueled by miscommunication, competition for resources, and the differing worldviews of the two cultures. Europeans perceived the Selk'nam as obstacles to development and settlement, a people to be managed, relocated, or eliminated. Incidents of violence increased, as settlers and bounty hunters saw the indigenous population as a problem rather than neighbors. Reports from the era recount both opportunistic attacks and organized efforts to control, remove, or subdue the Selk'nam. These confrontations marked the beginning of a tragic decline, initiated not by the harshness of the land but by the imposition of external power and greed. The arrival of Europeans also introduced disease, an invisible yet lethal force. Epidemics of smallpox, influenza, and other illnesses swept through Selk'nam communities with devastating speed. Entire families and small clans were wiped out before they could develop any immunity. The demographic impact was catastrophic, compounding the effects of displacement, violence, and disruption of traditional life. The Selk'nam, who had developed intricate knowledge and strategies to survive extreme natural conditions, were powerless against these new biological threats. Despite the destruction, early interactions were complex. Some Selk'nam attempted to engage with the newcomers through trade, learning new skills, and adopting certain tools. In some cases, alliances were temporarily formed, and mutual curiosity led to moments of exchange. However, the imbalance of power, coupled with European expansionist goals, meant that these interactions were overwhelmingly one-sided. The Selk'nam were gradually drawn into a system they neither initiated nor controlled, one in which their cultural autonomy was steadily eroded. Social disruption was profound. The relocation of families to mission stations separated communities, breaking the chains of knowledge transmission that had preserved hunting techniques, oral history, and ritual practices for generations. Seasonal migrations were interrupted, hunting patterns disrupted, and traditional shelters abandoned. The land that had been central to Selk'nam identity and survival was increasingly fenced off or occupied, leaving little space for cultural continuity. Even the spiritual framework of the Hain and other rituals became difficult to maintain, as the social cohesion required for these ceremonies was undermined by displacement and loss. The consequences of first contact reverberated through every aspect of Selk'nam life. The introduction of foreign goods, languages, and customs created a profound cultural shock. Elders and spiritual leaders struggled to maintain authority in a world suddenly dominated by strangers. Young Selk'nam were caught between ancestral traditions and the pressures of imposed European ways. Survival was no longer just a matter of navigating the natural environment, it became a struggle to navigate the rapidly changing social, economic, and spiritual landscape imposed by outsiders. First contact was the beginning of a long and devastating transformation. It set in motion the processes of assimilation, displacement, and demographic decline that would nearly erase the Selk'nam from their homeland. Yet even in these early interactions, their resilience and intelligence were evident. They adapted where they could, negotiated survival in new ways, and sought to preserve fragments of their culture against overwhelming odds. Their story at this stage is one of cautious engagement, the collision of worlds, and the fragile balance between curiosity and destruction. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the Selk'nam were confronted not only with foreign people but with entirely new concepts of property, power, and morality. The land that had sustained them for centuries was being transformed into private holdings, and the social and spiritual frameworks that had ensured survival were challenged by ideologies alien to their understanding. The early encounters reveal a people whose ingenuity, knowledge, and resilience were tested in ways that went far beyond the natural challenges of Tierra del Fuego, signaling the beginning of a tragic chapter in human history. This era of first contact illustrates a critical moment in the Selk'nam story. A society long adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth faced an unprecedented external force, one in which the rules of survival, culture, and power were suddenly dictated by outsiders. Their adaptation skills, once sufficient for the natural extremes of Tierra del Fuego, were no match for the complexities, violence, and exploitative pressures introduced by Europeans. It was here, at the intersection of two very different worlds, that the seeds of cultural collapse were sown, setting the stage for the dramatic and tragic events that would follow in the decades to come. The story of the Selk'nam people takes a dark and harrowing turn with the arrival of bounty hunters, a group whose presence turned survival into a calculated game of life and death. Tierra del Fuego, already a harsh and unforgiving environment, became a stage for violence fueled by greed, exploitation, and the unrelenting desire for profit. The Selk'nam, who had long mastered survival in one of the most extreme climates on Earth, suddenly faced a threat that was neither natural nor predictable. The deliberate targeting of their people for reward. European settlers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs had arrived in Tierra del Fuego seeking wealth and land. They were not content with mere acquisition of territory or livestock, they sought to remove obstacles, and the Selk'nam stood directly in the path of their ambitions. The indigenous population, whose nomadic routes crossed the fertile plains desired for sheep grazing, was seen not as human beings but as impediments to expansion. In this environment, the concept of bounty hunting emerged, a brutal system in which human lives were commodified, and killings were incentivized by payment. The most infamous of these hunters became known by the chilling nickname, the Red Pig. Accounts from the period describe him as a man who elevated cruelty into a profession, paying extra for the breasts of women killed, a grotesque indicator that a life had been taken. The Red Pig and others like him pursued the Selk'nam with relentless precision, moving through the plains and forests, tracking individuals and clans as though they were prey. They were armed with firearms, horses, and tactical knowledge that the Selk'nam, reliant on traditional weapons and intimate knowledge of the land, could hardly counter. These hunters did not merely kill in isolation, their actions were part of a systemic campaign of eradication. Ranchers and settlers encouraged, financed, and coordinated these attacks, seeing the removal of indigenous populations as essential to consolidating control over land and livestock. Large-scale operations were carried out, often involving multiple hunters working in coordination to clear entire areas of Selk'nam presence. Reports from the era, preserved in archival documents and testimonies, reveal the scale of the violence. Entire families and small bands were ambushed, chased across plains, and shot from horseback. The land that had once provided sustenance and refuge became a killing ground. The impact on the Selk'nam was immediate and devastating. Hunting, gathering, and seasonal migrations were disrupted as individuals went into hiding, fearing for their lives. Communities fragmented under the pressure of relentless pursuit, and social cohesion, once the foundation of survival, was shattered. Traditional practices, ceremonies, and the transmission of knowledge were interrupted, leaving elders unable to teach the next generation. The intricate social and spiritual fabric of Selk'nam life began to unravel under the weight of organized violence. The psychological effects of this campaign were profound. The Selk'nam, whose worldview emphasized harmony with the land, respect for spirits, and moral codes, were confronted with a force that was unpredictable, lethal, and morally incomprehensible. The land, which had once been a partner in survival, became a site of fear. Forests and plains that had long provided food, shelter, and spiritual connection were now zones of danger. The Selk'nam had to adapt to the presence of a predator they had never encountered before. One whose motives were purely material, indifferent to human life or cultural significance. The hunters' methods were as calculated as they were cruel. They often relied on intelligence from settlers who knew Selk'nam movements and seasonal patterns. Horses allowed them to track swiftly across difficult terrain, and firearms neutralized traditional hunting skills. Victims were frequently mutilated, leaving physical reminders of violence intended to terrorize survivors. This deliberate cruelty reinforced a system in which fear was used as a tool of control, ensuring that the Selk'nam could not effectively resist or organize. The Red Pig and his contemporaries were emblematic of a broader pattern of extermination that extended beyond individual acts of violence. Their actions were supported by social and legal systems that, at the time, often ignored or condoned killings of indigenous people. Rewards for the deaths of Selk'nam were formalized, creating an incentive structure in which the more individuals killed, the greater the profit. The Selk'nam were caught in a systematic eradication campaign, where every step taken to survive risked discovery, and every hiding place could become a death trap. Despite the overwhelming force, the Selk'nam demonstrated remarkable resilience. Individuals and small groups employed stealth, intimate knowledge of the land, and ingenuity to evade hunters. They learned to anticipate ambushes, move silently through forests, and rely on social networks for warning and support. Survival required not only physical skill but also the mental discipline to navigate an environment where the rules had fundamentally changed. Even as their numbers were decimated, the Selk'nam's strategies reflected a society that had evolved over centuries to thrive under extreme conditions, now forced to apply that ingenuity against a human adversary rather than nature. The long-term effects of the bounty hunting era were catastrophic. Population numbers plummeted, social structures collapsed, and traditional practices became increasingly difficult to maintain. Rituals, ceremonies, and knowledge transmission suffered severe disruption. The very cultural identity of the Selk'nam was threatened, as the constant threat of violence forced people into hiding, separated families, and created an atmosphere of persistent fear. The bounty hunters did not merely hunt for survival or sustenance, they hunted to erase a culture, to replace it with the settlers' vision of ownership and control. This period is a chilling illustration of the collision between indigenous knowledge and colonial greed. The Selk'nam, whose lives had been finely tuned to the rhythms of Tierra del Fuego, faced a force they could neither negotiate with nor resist effectively. The commodification of human life transformed the landscape into a space of terror and oppression, leaving scars not only on the physical environment but on the very social and spiritual foundations of Selk'nam society. Yet even amid the horror, the Selk'nam's ingenuity and resilience were evident. They adapted their movements, developed new hiding strategies, and sought to preserve elements of their culture in secret. Stories of escape, survival, and cautious interaction with outsiders testify to a people fighting to maintain their identity under extreme duress. The legacy of this violence is a stark reminder of the destructive power of greed and the fragility of human societies when faced with systematic extermination. In recounting this dark chapter, it becomes clear that the Selk'nam were not merely victims, they were skilled, intelligent, and adaptive, striving to survive against forces designed to annihilate them. The era of the Red Pig and the bounty hunters represents one of the most extreme confrontations between indigenous knowledge and colonial exploitation, illustrating how human cruelty compounded the natural challenges of survival in Tierra del Fuego. It is a story of terror, endurance, and the human capacity for both destruction and resilience, a story that continues to haunt the memory of the land and the descendants of those who once called it home. The story of the Selk'nam people, spanning centuries, is one of resilience, tragedy, and ultimately, a lesson for all humanity. From the windswept plains of Tierra del Fuego to the near erasure of their population, the Selk'nam's existence illuminates both the fragility and the strength of human culture. Their history is a chronicle of survival against the harshest environments, the devastation of colonial greed, the spread of disease, and the pressures of forced assimilation. And yet, it is also a story of persistence, memory, and the enduring power of identity. The final lesson of the Selk'nam begins with understanding what was lost. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Selk'nam population plummeted from thousands to mere hundreds. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, rituals, and traditions were threatened with oblivion. Ceremonies like the Hain, which had once structured social life and transmitted moral and ethical codes, could no longer be performed fully. Tools, songs, and stories that reflected the ingenuity required to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth were at risk of vanishing forever. Families were scattered, and the connection to ancestral lands was severed. The Selk'nam, who had harmonized with nature, faced destruction not from storms or scarcity, but from human actions that commodified life and disregarded cultural significance. Yet, in this story of near extinction lies a profound insight: even when a culture is nearly obliterated, its legacy can endure. The work of ethnographers like Martin Guzand and Chapman preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been irretrievably lost. Photographs, recordings, and meticulous notes allowed future generations to glimpse the richness of Selk'nam life, their tools, rituals, language, and social structures. These records became a bridge across time, enabling descendants and scholars to piece together a culture almost erased from memory. The resurgence of Selk'nam identity in the modern era demonstrates that cultural survival is not merely biological, it is social, spiritual, and symbolic. Language revival, ritual reconstruction, art, and storytelling are all methods through which a people can reclaim agency over their history. The Selk'nam today, scattered but determined, assert their presence in educational, cultural, and legal arenas. They remind the world that identity is not solely inherited, it is actively cultivated, remembered, and performed. Even fragments of culture, when preserved and nurtured, can inspire resilience and continuity. From a broader perspective, the Selk'nam story is a warning. It illustrates the devastating consequences of colonization, resource exploitation, and the imposition of external systems upon indigenous populations. When outsiders prioritize greed, land, and profit over human life and cultural integrity, entire societies can be brought to the brink of erasure. The Selk'nam experience demonstrates that cultural destruction is not inevitable. It is the result of choices, policies, and actions that fail to respect the intrinsic value of human diversity. Yet the Selk'nam also teach us about hope, adaptation, and the human spirit. Their story shows that even after extreme adversity, culture can survive in memory, in descendants, and in revived practices. It highlights the importance of documentation, intergenerational transmission, and active engagement with heritage. It underscores the fact that every society, no matter how small or marginalized, possesses knowledge, wisdom, and creativity that is valuable not only to its members but to humanity as a whole. In the end, the lesson of the Selk'nam is universal. Vanishing cultures are not relics of the past, they are living reminders of the stakes involved in preserving human diversity. Each language, ritual, and tradition carries knowledge about survival, social cohesion, ethical frameworks, and our relationship with the natural world. The near disappearance of the Selk'nam urges us to consider what is lost when a culture is erased, and conversely, what can be gained when we recognize, respect, and support the continuation of diverse cultural practices. Their story resonates beyond Tierra del Fuego. It is a cautionary tale for all who witnessed the vanishing of indigenous populations worldwide. It asks societies to confront the consequences of colonization, industrialization, and neglect. But it is also a story of resilience, showing that recovery, reclamation, and cultural revival are possible even after near-total destruction. It demonstrates that legacy is not defined solely by survival in the present but also by memory, recognition, and the capacity to inspire future generations. Ultimately, the Selk'nam remind us that culture is fragile, yet extraordinarily powerful. Even when a people are nearly erased, their ideas, stories, and values can persist, haunting, inspiring, and educating those who come after them. Their journey from thriving hunter-gatherers, to victims of violence and disease, to a modern resurgence of identity, offers a profound reflection on humanity's responsibility toward one another and the importance of preserving the world's vanishing cultures. It is a story that warns, teaches, and ultimately inspires, a final lesson from a people who lived at the edge of the world and left a legacy that refuses to vanish completely.